بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم وأكمل التحيات على سيد السادات سيدنا ونبينا محمد خير البريات وآله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. Alhamdulillah, in our look at Mukhtasar Imam al-Quduri, we have reached one of the most important of chapters, and that's the chapter on Ribba. And this chapter, of course, highlights a basic reality as well, that the fuqaha are concerned with bayan al-ahkam, right? Their concern is to make rulings clear. So they won't necessarily caution you, warn you about the importance, significance, danger, or even, moral consequence of an action. They always say these are the rulings, right? But in our times, particularly for the general public, but also for students of knowledge, we need to be very clear of the moral significance of actions and the moral consequence of actions, lest we, not recognize the gravity of a particular matter. And one of these key sections, key issues, is the issue of, riba and its prohibition. And we've recommended the treatise by Mufti Taqi Usmani on the prohibition of riba, and that's something that, I'm looking forward to seeing a summary from anyone who's got the gumption to do so, because it's very important. So there are multiple sets of verses in the Quran regarding the prohibition of riba. Right? The prohibition of riba came down gradually, but it is unequivocal. Right? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in it lays down a number of things. So we can look at the prohibition of riba in terms of its prohibition and its harm. Right? Its prohibition and its harm. The prohibition, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala just lays down very clearly, أَحَلَّ اللَّهُ الْبَيْعَ وَحَرَّمَ الرِّبَى. Right? Allah has permitted trade and has permitted trade, al-bay' وَحَرَّمَ الرِّبَى, but prohibited usury, riba. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not define what riba is in the Quran. And one of the reasons He does not define it, because riba was well known to the Arabs. وَالْبَيِّن لَا يُبَيَّن, and that which is clear does not require definition. The Quraysh were traders, particularly, but the Arabs in general had to trade because they didn't have much. Right? Their lands were not fertile lands. Their lands did not have industry and many of the things that they needed. They traded. رِحْلَةَ الشِّتَاءِ وَالصَّيْفِ, right? The journeys of winter and summer. Right? In winter to Yemen, and in the summer, because it would be cooler in Yemen at that time, and in summer to Sham. So riba was well known to the Arabs, which is why it's not defined in the Quran, and the Sahaba did not ask the Prophet ﷺ about the meaning of riba itself. There's some details that they inquired about. Why? Because they understood what it is, and the Prophet ﷺ explained out details regarding it. Right? So that's number one. The prohibition is very clear. The mushrikeen says, إِنَّمَا الْبَيْعُ مِثْلُ الرِّبَى, that trade is like riba. And in one sense, there is a similarity between the two. Right? In a transaction, right, if you finance, let's say, we've been selling my mic extensively, right? So let's say the sister really liked the mic, but this is like a $150 mic, but let's say it's a $1,500 mic. You wanted it. So how much is the mic? $1,500. Oops. We already made plans, you needed it. So if you went and sought financing for it, how would it be financed, which would be considered riba? And we'll look at the definition of riba. But it's financed, let's say, they say, well, you're buying it for 1,500. So you buy it, or let's say Zubaydah, since you wouldn't do something haram. So Zubaydah buys it for 1,500 and finances her purchase for 1,500 plus a percentage. Right? That percentage is riba. So the sale happens at 1,500. And there's a percentage above and beyond the price, that is the financing. That X percent is riba. Right? And they define riba, right? And he actually, the definition of riba is given in the commentary of Lubab, but it is زيادة مشروطة في عقد معاوضة مال بمال مشروطة لأحد المتعاقدين. Right? Riba is an increase stipulated in a contract of exchange of something of value for something of value, specified, the increase being specified to one of the two transacting parties. Right? So here, you purchase, the sale itself is, I sell you this mic for 1,500 plus X percent. That X percent is riba. That for X percent, whether it's X percent being connected to its deferral, whether one time or installments or future payment, whichever of the ways of deferral, that increase is riba. Now, in itself, in terms of the limit itself, what if instead, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أَحَلَّ اللَّهُ الْبَيْعَ وَحَرَّمَ, Allah has permitted trade and prohibited riba. Right? And the objection does arise. And it's mentioned in the Quran so that nobody till the end of time can make that objection. That, well, look, could I, you come and say, I want to buy this mic. I said 1,500. You can't pay 1,500 right now because you've got other expenses to take care of. So instead, what do? I say, look, could you make 18 monthly payments of $100? Sure. So okay, so I'll sell it to you for 1,800, due in 18 payments of $100. What did we agree upon? I'll sell you the mic for $1,800 in 18 monthly payments, or whatever. Or we could be $1,800 payable in 18 months from now. Whichever way of deferral. This is trade. I can sell anything for any price. Now, practically, is there a similarity between the two? Yeah, there is. And Allah does not deny that. The disbelievers say that trade is like riba. But Allah has permitted this and not permitted that. So there is an aspect of the prohibition of riba that is ta'abbudi, that is a devotional matter, that Allah has prohibited. In some scenarios, the difference between trade, like selling this at a higher price if it's deferred, is not clear from riba. You're paying more. You're affirming a time value for money. These are considerations related to the prohibition of riba. They're not the legal cause of the prohibition of riba. You could end up paying more. Let's say, I just say, look, if you want I like the mic, I don't want to sell it. You want it? I'll sell it to you for $2,100 for payable over 1 year. For a lot more. If you finance it through riba, it will be less. Does that make the riba permitted and the sale not permitted? No. The sales transaction is permitted, the riba remains impermissible. So that's an important aspect of the ruling itself, right? That the definition of riba is an increase stipulated in a contract of exchange, stipulated to either party, and that increase. But if that increase is incorporated into the contract itself, it's no longer riba. How? If you bought it upfront, I'd sell it to you for 1,500. If you buy it deferred, I'll sell it to you for whatever price, as long as there's no lying, cheating, or deception. And there's a moral dimension, of course, of not selling things for a gross markup. But selling things for gross markup is only blameworthy when there is deception involved, actual or implicit. Right? And ethically, one should make it clear. Right? So Umar and I agreed that there would be a sign put up, because the books at Seekers are marked up. I cautioned Umar that we have to put a note that proceeds from the books go to support Seekers guidance, whatever, because they're being sold for more than the market price. Okay? Clearly more than the market price, and it's morally superior to mention that. Umar, being the trader in this case, needed to defer to me on that, because he said, no, but there's a moral recommendation. It's not obligatory because it's not being sold for a grossly higher price, generally speaking. But there's no deception in it. If you claim that this is a good price, then it'll be haram. Right? Someone could take you to court for that, Islamically. Anyways, so this is the basis of the prohibition, that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has prohibited riba unconditionally, and even when it resembles riba, even when the trade resembles riba, the trade remains prohibited, and the riba remains prohibited, and the trade remains permitted. But there's also a wisdom in the prohibition of riba. Right? There's a wisdom in the prohibition of riba. And it's important to appreciate the wisdom in the prohibition of riba, to appreciate why it is so gravely prohibited. Right? Which is that, and it's understood by an example. If we posited a model of the world, right? Let's say if this was the world, so the women were rich, the men were poor. Let's say there's rich women and poor men. So men need to borrow from the women to survive. And if the women lent on interest, what would happen? If you had a closed model, there's only 2 women and 4 men. The women lend, the men borrow because they're poor. What would happen on interest? That there would be a steady flow of wealth from the poor to the rich. The rich would get richer and the poor would get poorer. And this is one of the economic justice considerations of a lot of Islamic law related to finance and economics. Right? So that wealth does not merely circulate amongst the wealthy. Right? And this leads to, entrenched economic injustice, where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, which leads to not only material harm, but that material harm leads to all kinds of social and human harm, material and spiritual. It vitiates the preservation of good and the prevention of harm, material, social, and spiritual. Right? So if they are and also because there's no risk in lending broadly, right? Especially if you consider power dynamics as well in it, because the rich can charge interest and they can enforce their demand because they have more influence. The rich have typically more influence on political and social systems. So they'll get their rights, right? So now where is this manifest? Right? Where is this manifest? This is particularly manifest at the macroeconomic level. Right? At the macroeconomic level, at the global level. For a long time, there were many developing countries, or what some economists called the underdeveloping countries, that got into debt, right? And there are countries whose debt payments each year, just the interest payments on their debt, is greater than their annual GDP, gross domestic product. So every year, even if their citizens just gave all their economic output just to pay their interest payments, they would not be able to do that. It leads to that kind of circumstance. So, of course, there are people who extend loans and stuff to developing countries, but on exorbitant rates of interest. And this is at the level of nations, but also at the level, at the society level, at a macro level. Right? All kinds of predatory lending and so on. So what happens? Right? Who suffers particularly is those whose primary economic relationship with financing institutions is borrowing to finance their stuff. Canadians, for example. Canada is not a poor country, right? With the facilitation of credit, and it fluctuates. There are years when Canadians had more debt than their own personal equity, right? So they end up getting more and more poor, even though they have a good earning. And at a personal level, it leads to overconsumption. It encourages overconsumption and puts one in debt, and one ends up disadvantaging oneself materially, right? Disadvantaging oneself materially. Now, in individual cases, someone could say, well, I need a house, etc. But you are being party to a system that is of general, societal, and human harm, which is the ribawi system. And Allah has, that's where, even when, like, if we're to finance it in a Sharia compliant way versus a ribawi way, it seems similar. Actually, in places where Sharia compliant financing is not readily available, you're probably going to pay more for the Sharia compliant financing than the ribawi financing, like quote unquote conventional financing. But it remains haram because it's riba, right? And it does have discernible harms at the human level and at the societal level. At the macro level. You can call it the super macro level and the macro level. In individual cases, broadly, it does have harm. Now, of course, the way things are set up in many countries, for you to finance a home, etc., tax benefits are given and all kinds of benefits are given to incentivize you borrowing money. Okay? And a lot of that, if you look at why are things structured in that way, is to get you in debt. Why are home prices so high? There are a lot of it's speculation. It's a way of making money for both the financing parties and the whole range of economic actors in society benefit from these ribawi setups. Because everyone but the individual benefits from the steady inflation of home and real estate prices. Right? Whether at the level, so the wealthy get wealthier. Whether you are a seller or a financier, or you're a landowner and you are renting out your home. Rents in a place like Mississauga are ridiculously high. Why? Because the whole, you have to summarize in one word, it's called riba. Riba. Now, you are still stuck in that system if you finance in Sharia compliant ways, but at the very least, you are not party to a system that is of such grave human harm. Now, we are in a wealthy country by any international standard. People are seriously struggling, even in a wealthy country, because of the harms of the system, even at the level of the middle class, etc., let alone those who are poor. People are really struggling. People commute for ages and so on. Why can't people live close to work, etc.? Because of the system. In other places, people are just crushed. People are just crushed by the system. So, but that's to do with the wisdom of the ruling. The underlying reason is Allah has permitted this and prohibited that. Right? So that's the wisdom. The gravity of the harm makes it something. So there is a discernible material harm in it. We touched a little about that. It's detailed much further in treatises on Ribba. This is a very broad, abstract stroke on it. But there is also a clear spiritual harm, because harms in things are, but the benefits and harms of any ruling, and Al-Izz ibn Abd al-Salam, who's known as Sultan al-Ulama, has a brilliant work called Al-Qawa'id al-Kubra, the greater principles of underlying law, and he abridged it himself in Al-Qawa'id al-Sughra. And the Qawa'id al-Sughra, at least for slackers, it's, for a committed slacker, it's definitely worth the read. And really simplifying what he talks about in part of his work, Al-Izz ibn Abd al-Salam, that the the basis is that the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala relate to benefits and harms of human beings, right? But the benefit and harm of rulings is, how much is something emphasized or rewarded is to the extent of the benefit in a matter, right? So the reward of something, the ruling of something and its reward is to the extent of its benefit. And the discouragement or prohibition of something and its punishment is to the extent of its harm. That's important to be clear about, right? But then the critical thing to appreciate that the harm of a ruling, the benefit of a ruling or a harm is either material or spiritual. Material or spiritual. Worldly or next worldly. The material meaning material, worldly, spiritual, next worldly. And it can be personal or collective. Personal or collective. Right? Because, if I cheat you and sell you this mic for 5,000, did I hurt myself in any way, materially? No, I pocketed some extra money. There's no material harm for me, but there's spiritual harm for me. And there's next worldly consequence for that. But there is a public harm in that, in the other party. And a societal harm in that, when there is lying or cheating or deception in transactions, it diminishes trust, which has an economic harm on society. And then this benefit and harm can be discernible, it can be clear or subtle. Right? And when it's subtle, it could be discernible or not discernible. Right? So that's a framework for rulings. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has specified, so there are clear economic harms, certainly at the macro and super macro level in riba, and also frequently at a personal level, because debt is to your material disadvantage. Right? But there are spiritual harms. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran, الَّذِينَ يَأْكُلُونَ الرِّبَا, those who consume riba, لَا يَقُومُونَ إِلَّا إلا كما يقوم الذي يتخبطه الشيطان من المس. Right? Those who consume riba stand only as one who stands if being driven crazy by the touch of the devil. Right? I met a righteous Bedouin in Jordan, and he had very little exposure to most of modern society. he was standing at the back of the masjid, and there's all these Westerners in the masjid. And he said, I have a question about these Westerners. I said, what? He said, they seem to have a lot of waswasa. They have a lot of confusion. I said, tell me about it, because I was teaching many of them. It's like a big problem. He said, do their parents consume riba? Probably most of them. I said, I had to understand. I said, don't they read the Quran? For him it was so clear. Right? He says, anytime you see strange things in society, this is مصداق قول رب العالمين. It's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says. Why do people act crazy? One of the frequent causes, because they're eating riba. But also because what drives the consumption of riba is lack of restraint. There are many subtle causes of it. Lack of restraint, lack of taqwa, right? Leads to excess in consumption, but also leads to excess in conduct. The two are interrelated. And when you eat from the haram, you will do the haram. Right? And that's part of the spiritual wisdom. There's a spiritual relationship between causes and effects. Right? They have material consequences, but have spiritual consequences. Right? And that's why, but because of both types of harms, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has also warned in the Quran that فَإِن لَمْ تَنْتَهُوا يَنْتَهُوا فَإِن لَمْ تَنْتَهُوا فَإِن لَمْ تَفْعَلُوا فَأْذَنُوا بِحَرْبٍ مِّنَ اللَّهِ وَرَسُولِهِ. And if you do not desist, if you do not desist, then فَأْذَنُوا, right? Then hear a proclamation of war from Allah and His Messenger. There are only two matters that Allah has proclaimed war upon those who willfully engage in it. One is, and that the Quranic proclamation is, willfully consuming riba. And in the hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari, the other instance is of declaration of war on a believer. It's not a declaration of war on those who fight the religion of Allah. Is مَنْ عَادَ لِي وَلِيًّا فَقَدْ آذَنْتُهُ بِالْحَرْبِ. That whoever shows enmity to an elect servant of mine, I declare war upon. And the hadith, it's a hadith Qudsi, mentioned in Sahih al-Bukhari. And that's why never feel at enmity. And one of the category of people who one would expect to be awliya of Allah are the ulama. Okay? Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi relates in Al-Faqih al-Mutafaqih, both from Imam Abu Hanifa and from Imam al-Shafi'i, with very similar wording, maybe almost identical wording, and he has chains of transmission for both, I believe, that إِن لَمْ يَكُنِ الْعُلَمَاء الْعَامِلُونَ أَوْلِيَاءُ اللَّهِ فَلَيْسَ لِلَّهِ أَوْلِيَاء. That both are reported to have said, with similar wording, if I recall correctly. If the ulama who act on their knowledge are not from the elect servants of Allah, then Allah does not have elect servants, which would be absurd because He's mentioned His awliya. Right? So one has to be particularly careful about ulama or any broadly upright Muslim, even if they commit sin. Right? One disagrees with the sin, with the wrong, even with the injustice, but don't be at enmity with them. Right? And that applies, if you can do that with all believers, that be at enmity to their wrongdoing, to their injustice, to their sin. You hate the sin, but not that. You are in safety because you don't know who is dear to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? And someone who spends a lifetime of doing good in their private life, even more so someone that spends a lifetime serving, and then they commit some grave errors, hate the error, Don't hate, because you're under serious danger. You don't know which way the balance tilts. Are they beloved to Allah or not? Don't take that risk of being at war with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So anyways, and that's very dangerous. And Allah says, فَهَلْ أَنْتُمْ مُنْتَهُونَ. So will you then desist? Right? And these key verses and the historical order of revelation of them is discussed by Mufti Taqi Usmani in his treatise. And that's a very important treatise, and it bears reflection. And we'll just mention a few of the hadiths related to the prohibition of riba, just to appreciate. So, amongst these hadiths, right, is because there's so many, right? But just to pick a few of them, there's a hadith in Sahih Muslim, for example, from Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, that he said, لعن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم آكل الربا وموكله. Right? That the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam cursed both the one who consumes riba and the one who gives riba. Right? And a curse is not, like, Allah is not there to insult anybody. A curse is al-ib'ad an rahmatillah. That it's distances from divine mercy. Right? Why? Because of the harm in it. Right? And there's many narrations of this, right, from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Right? And similarly, in a hadith related by Ibn Majah, we're just picking a few of the hadiths from Umar ibn al-Khattab, right? That inna akhira ma nazalat ayatul riba, that from the last verses that were revealed were the verses of riba. Right? It says, وَإِنَّ رَسُولَ اللَّهِ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَسَلَّمَ لَمْ يُفَسِّرْهَا لَنَا. And the Prophet ﷺ did not explain it to us. And one of the reasons of that being, this hadith is sahih, because it was clear, as Al-Jassas and others make clear, right? And the commentators on Ibn Majah, like Sindi and others. Because the verse was clear, the Prophet ﷺ did not explain it. And some people misinterpret these words of Sayyidina Umar, and then he said, فَدَعُوا الرِّبَى وَالرِّبَى. So leave riba itself and leave all unclear matters. Leave even the things that have a resemblance to riba. Right? And the Prophet ﷺ proclaimed this, right, during the final Hajj as well. Right? It's one of the things that he made clear in the final Hajj. Right? And the Prophet ﷺ also warned to keep away not only from riba itself, but from participating, from any direct participation in the riba, in riba. So there's a hadith in the Musnad of Imam Ahmad, and it's a Hasan hadith. There's a number of related narrations as well. So Sayyidina Ali relates, لَعْنَ رَسُولُ اللَّهِ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَسَلَّمَ صَاحِبَ الرِّبَى وَآكِلَهُ وكاتبه وشاهديه والمحلل والمحلل له. That the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam cursed the one who gives riba, and the one who consumes riba, and the one who records riba, and the one who witnesses riba, and the one who deems it permitted, and the one who deems it permitted for them. Right? So keep away from riba. And why? And this is the messenger of mercy. Right? وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَاكَ إِلَّا رَحْمَةً. The curse of the Prophet ﷺ is a warning that this matter distances you from divine mercy. He's not there insulting anyone. He comes there as a nadhirun mubin, as a clear warner. Keep away from this, because this will keep you away from divine mercy. That is how we understand the prophetic curse. Right? And there's many similar hadiths regarding this. And in some hadiths, it has even come that consuming riba is worse than publicly fornicating with one's own mother. Right? Because one's a private sin between two parties. Right? But the harm of riba is far greater societally, right, than such a grave and odious matter. Right? And it's explained out. So that's a little bit about that, which is so, and that can be challenging at some, and someone wants to see the harms of that, and to see the rise of the 1% and the 1% of the 1%, and what our own foreign minister wrote a book about it before she came to join politics, called The Plutocrats and How They Live. It's all riba. Right? All through a ribawi system. Right? How do these mega corporations emerge? Riba. How was India taken over? It's through riba. Right? Like the rise of these mega corporations, historically, it's riba financing. And that enabled a private company to take over a whole country. Right? And these have devastating human impact. Right? So that's just a little bit of background. So, and just to, we're not, we have many answers on seekers related to this, but the position of the ulama who are considered unequivocally the living authorities in fiqh in our times, that, as one of them put it in his treatise on the subject, فَوَائِدُ الْبُنُوكِ هِيَ الرِّبَى الْحَرَامِ, that bank interest is the riba that was prohibited. Because the core riba, the Quraysh were traders. The simplest way of engaging in riba that they engaged with was, you want to go on a trade mission? Right? I could be a partner with you in it. Right? So Hamza wants to go to Sham to trade. If I know Hamza and I trust him, etc., I might partner with him. But that's a lot of risk. A lot of risk. If I enter into a partnership with him, what happens? I may profit, but I may lose. And people are risk averse. The human being is risk averse. Right? And a sure benefit is more pleasing than risk. There's a rational case for wanting riba at a personal level, because it's more secure. So I have two options. I could either make 10% by lending you money on riba, or I could possibly make 25 to 50% by investing in you and sharing the profit. The one who has money, to the extent possible, wants to guarantee their return. But what is to your advantage as the one who needs the money? To be in a situation, whether you make money or not, you have to give up a specific percentage. Even if you lost money, you have to pay me back. with interest. Or if you make money, you share in the profit, you share the profits with the investor, and if you lose money, the investor shares in your loss. Right? Now, people who have money don't want to do that frequently, but there is a socio-economic case for that. It is aqrab lil-adl. It is closer to justice. Right? To have a balance in society. Right? Have a balance in society. So the ideal that Allah and His Messenger call us to is trade and investment. Right? Is someone starting up, to invest in that, and that is a far more healthy economic relationship, and also gives responsibility. It gives responsibility. So they say that lending someone money can have greater reward than giving them charity. Why? Because you give someone charity. So Zubaydah starting a company, you lend her 10,000, you just give her 10,000. Here you go. She's just starting off, she'll blow it. But she'll buy fancy laptops and the shiny new mic and this and that, get a mini podcasting studio, and then doesn't bother doing anything. Why? Because you just gave her the money. Then afterwards she goes looking for more money. Right? But if you lend the money, she'll feel more responsibility. Why? Because now she has to pay it back. Of course, a halal loan. Right? Qard hasan. That's a charitable act. You want to help someone out? Give them a qard hasan. But if you want to make money, what would you do? You cannot lend money. You cannot make money by lending money. Simple as that. Rather, you have a number of options available. The ideal is what's called, you become a partner. You can become the investing partner. So let's say, you set terms, etc. We'll be looking at that on musharaka, etc. These are chapters that are coming up. So you can't do that. Right? You can't just lend the money on return. Now, similarly, if you want to save money, what do? This has implications for a consumer. When you save money, can you just put your money in the bank and earn interest on it? That's ribba. That's ribba. But it's praiseworthy to invest the money. It's praiseworthy to invest the money. Now there's permitted investment, which is any halal investment, right? But as a community, as an ummah, we need to be thinking about the fact that are the values that we uphold being promoted by investing in the stock of Google and Facebook and Microsoft and the big multinational corporations, etc. Right? Just go through what are the top 50 Canadian companies. What do they do? Right? So yeah, it's a secure investment, great. It's permissible insofar as that investment is permissible, right? So that their primary engagement is not something haram, it's permitted to invest in that. And it's better for you to invest the money than to squander it. But is that anywhere close to the Islamic ideal? No. Whom are you empowering in society? Whom are you uplifting? Whom are you assisting? Within our community itself and in the broader society. Right? And that's why there's been a rise of what's called socially conscious investment. Right? Ethical investment and socially conscious investment. And that's something to seriously consider, and Muslims have to take that very, very seriously. Very, very seriously. And the fact that we don't have that, and the solution isn't just to have a Sharia-compliant index of stocks on the Dow Jones or in the stock market, that any stocks that fulfill these criteria, they're halal, and this is how you purify your wealth from their interest earnings. That's halal. And for a lot of people, the bare minimum is fine. But that does not fulfill any higher aims of the Sharia, and we need to be aware of that, right? Right? So this is an important background related to the prohibition of riba. Now let's see the chapter on riba, right? The author, Imam al-Quduri rahimahullah, says, Babu riba, the chapter on riba. I have a note here that تحريمها بالآيات الصريحة. Right? Its prohibition is with explicit verses of the Quran. وتكفي تهديدا لكل عاقل. And they're sufficient as warning for any person of intelligence. والنهي فيها حكمة بالغة. And the prohibition in it has manifest wisdom, both material and spiritual. Right? So he says, الربا محرم في كل مكيل وموزون. Right? Riba is prohibited in everything that is sold by weight or volume. Right? And riba in the Arabic language means, in the broad lexical meaning is increase, az-ziyada. And the Shari'i meaning, right, is given by, it's what we mentioned before, right? So he gives a definition, right? وشرعا فضل خال عن عوض بمعيار شرعي مشروط لأحد المتعاقدين في المعاوضة. Right? It's a stipulated increase without material consideration, affirmed through a Sharia recognized basis, which is that which is sold by weight or volume, or that which is considered like weight or volume, such as number, specified to either transacting party in a contract of exchange, right? So he says it is prohibited in every transaction that is by weight or volume, by volume, makil, or mawzoon, by weight, right? So there's here broadly there are two types of riba, right? One is riba that applies to riba in exchange, and then there's riba in financing. So riba in exchange, which is a little more rare, but it comes up a lot with wholesalers. Riba in exchange is if we're traders, right? So she's taken up business, so she decides to go into wholesaling wheat. So she finds some basmati rice. Like she has a surplus of basmati rice because she didn't realize that there's all these other customers in the Greater Toronto area who want other types of rice. So you want to get some particular Vietnamese rice. So can you trade 1,000 kilos of basmati rice for 1,500 kilos of a particular type of Vietnamese rice? No. That is riba in exchange, right? If the item is from the same category, like rice for rice, then certain rulings arise, which we'll look at here, right? That you have to sell at par and you cannot make it a deferred sale, right? If you're selling the same category. The way to get out of it is to break it into two transactions. Rather than exchanging 1,000 kilos of basmati rice for 1,500 kilos of whatever other rice, you say, I'll sell you the basmati rice for $2,500 or for $25,000, and second contract, I'll buy 1,500 kilos of whatever rice for $2,500. And and the two debts would cancel each other. That's a simple way to avoid the riba of exchange. And this is something to teach people, and people engage in this a lot more than you can imagine. A lot of wholesalers, etc., make exchanges all the time, right? And that's the meaning of riba. And in our times, practically, things sold by units are considered like that which is sold by weight and volume, very simply. So someone is a computer wholesaler. 10 laptops for 15 laptops, don't do it. Just break it into 2 transactions, set whatever price for it that can cancel each other out. So break it into 2 contracts, it's not riba. Right? Okay. So, right? So he says, إذا بيع بجنسه متفاضلا. If one thing is sold for something from the same category, jins, متفاضلا, with a difference in amount, in the extent, the quantity. Right? So you cannot sell 10 kilos if you're exchanging dates for dates. You have to, and let's say we're selling by weight, you have to sell at par, even if the quality differs. If we're selling the same item, then quality is not of consideration. Type is not of consideration. Well, these are much more precious. Right? If you're exchanging the same category of item, then إذا اتحد الجنس فلا عبرة بالوصف في باب الربا. Right? So if it's sold for its same category, متفاضلا, in different amounts. فالعلة فيه الكيل مع الجنس أو الوزن مع الجنس. So the legal cause for the prohibition of riba is the volume with the with the category, or the weight with the category. So they say it's there's two. If 2 things are found, then it's riba, which is al-jins ma' al-qadr, the category with the qadr, which is with the quantity, whether that quantity is weight or volume or units, right? Or units has the same. Getting? Okay. Right? فإذا بيع المكيل أو الموزون بجنسه مثلا بمثل جاز البيع. So if something sold by volume or something sold by weight is sold for something of the same category, the same type, dates for dates, rice for rice, right? For the like, for the same, at par, for the same quantity, then the sale is permitted, right? Right? So you can only sell something of this, you can only exchange things from the same category, whether sold by weight, volume, or number, at par. They cannot. وَإِن تَفَاضَلَا لَمْ يَجُزْ. But if they are at different, you sold them for different amounts, 10 kilos of dates for 7 kilos of dates, even if the quality is different, لَمْ يَجُزْ. It is not allowed, because then it's considered riba. The illah of riba, the legal cause of riba, is اتحاد الجنس والقدر. That it's the same, that you're selling something of the same category and the same extent, of the same, and the same basis, right? The same basis. So that applies with money as well, of course, because when you lend something, what is going on? You're giving $100 now, same category, And the basis for counting it is number. $100. So if you're giving money now, it's a contract of exchange. For money due later, then it has to be at par. Right? So debt falls under this definition as well, because it's the same category. Now, could you avoid that by saying, I'll lend you, but so what about currency exchange? I'll lend you $100 now and you pay me 240 euro in 10 years. So we look at what are present exchange rates. Right? Because that's not a way of circumventing riba. Right? And we'll get to that when we look at the rulings of monetary exchange. Okay. ولا يجوز بيع الجيد بالرديء أو الجيد بالرديء مما فيه الربا إلا مثلا بمثل. And it's not permitted to sell good quality, something of good quality for something of low quality in that which riba relates to, where it's the same category and you're selling it on the same basis by weight or volume or units, except at par, mithlan bimithl, at par. So you've got the highest quality majdul dates, so 10 kilos of that, for some old, stale, low quality dates. If you want to make that transaction, if you just want to exchange it, it has to be at par. Now you want to sell 10 kilos of these for 30 kilos of that, what do? Sell these 10 kilos for $30, and I'll buy 30 kilos of those for $30. If you break it into two transactions, there's no riba. You don't have to exchange money. One debt can cancel another. So that's the way to get out of all of this and to be very, very. Now, there is something that some of the fiqh books mention, but just to be very clear, I can't go into a lot of detail on it right now, is the basis of trade used to be weight or volume. That's how the Arabs traded. Even money was weighed. You have a whole bunch of dirhams, you do it by, silver coins, you'd weigh them. Gold coins, you'd weigh them. Right? Because they'd have a standard. Right? So you count them, but what would count was the weight value of those gold coins. Things were only sold by units customarily for small amounts. Right? That's why they say, so they said in small amounts, they used to say that there's no riba in it, fil adadi. But then when that became a norm, and there's a historical time period when that happened, when there's a serious challenging of the value of silver, etc., for many historic reasons, right? Transaction expanded significantly in fulus, right? In base currencies, right? And also people started bartering a lot more due to many aspects of financial instability. So trade increased in al-adadiyat, right? In things sold by number, including fulus. So the fatwa there is that things sold by number, the fatwa is that there also has to be mithlan bimithl. It has to be at par in things sold by units. So you can't sell 10 fountain pens for 12 fountain pens, even if they're different qualities, right? Because otherwise these become vehicles for riba, right? Because in our times the default is people sell things by unit. We don't weigh pens. We don't weigh computers. We don't weigh most, there's only a subset of things that we weigh. Anyways, فإذا عُدِم الوصفان أي الجنس والمعنى المضموم إليه حل التفاضل والنساء. If both meanings are not found, so we're selling two separate categories of things. Selling dates for rice, right? One is sold, there are two categories. Dates and rice are two separate categories. Let's say dates are sold by weight, rice is sold by volume, let's just say. Then we can sell, then two things are allowed. At tafadul, we can sell at different quantities, and we can sell والنساء. النساء is البيع إلى أجل. We can defer, right? التأخير, as the commentary mentions, مغرب, right? Because neither legal cause for riba is found. It's two different categories, and the basis, weight, volume, units, is different, right? وَإِذَا وُجِدَا, if both meanings are found, same category and same criteria, weight, volume, or units, then حرم التفاضل والنساء. If both meanings are found, we're exchanging dates for dates, they have to be at par, they cannot be at variant amounts, and you cannot defer it. I cannot sell you 100 kilos of dates now for 100 kilos due in a year's time. So it has to be at par, and it has to be an immediate sale, because that also can become a way of indirect debt financing, right? If you want to, there's workarounds, of course, if you think about it. So then, there are things that are customarily sold by weight, right? In our times, in kilos, for example, right? And there are things that are customarily sold by liter, by volume. Liters is a measure of volume. Now the challenge is that there's a number of things that the Prophet ﷺ referred to as being sold by weight, and there's things that the Prophet ﷺ referred to as being sold by volume. So this is Imam al-Quduri says rahimahullah, وَكُلُّ شَيْءٍ نَصَّ رَسُولُ اللَّهِ صلى الله عليه وسلم على تحريم التفاضل فيه كيلا فهو مكيل أبدا وإن ترك الناس الكيل فيه مثل الحنطة والشعير والتمر والملح وكل ما نص صلى الله عليه وسلم على تحريم التفاضل فيه وزنا فهو موزون أبدا مثل الذهب والفضة وما لم ينص عليه فهو محمول على عادات الناس. So Imam al-Quduri says everything that the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam prohibited selling at variance by volume, that it is always considered to be of the things sold by volume, even if people stopped trading in it by volume. And he gives two examples such as wheat, barley, dates, and salt, because these are mentioned in a direct hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that they're sold kaylan bikayl, by volume. And everything that the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam stipulated as being prohibited to sell at variance by weight, then it's considered to be of the things that are wazni, that are where selling them at variance by weight abadan is always considered to be of the things sold by weight, such as gold and silver, even if people trade in them separately. This is the asl al-madhab, but and then he says وَمَا لَمْ يُنَصَّ عَلَيْهِ, and that which is not textually established to be makil or mawzun, of that which is not textually established to be sold by weight or sold by volume, then we consider it by the custom of people. right? So let's say if we figured out some trick, right? That let's say we traded and we calculated it. So I traded $1,000 in cash. But I sold 20 kilos of cash money for 20 kilos of paper money plus coins. Can you buy and sell coins by weight or money by weight? No. That's like a vehicle for riba. And here there's an extensive discussion in the commentary, right? But the summary is, and this is found in Hashid ibn Abdin, volume 4, page 181 to 182, that there's a narration from Abu Yusuf, and it's an thani. It's a narration from Abu Yusuf, right? اعتبار العرف مطلقا ورجحه الكمال وفي الكافي الفتوى على عادة الناس كما في البحر وأقره المصنف, right? So it's mentioned that, so in the Durr al-Mukhtar of Imam al-Haskafi, it's mentioned that there's a narration from Abu Yusuf that we consider the custom of people, meaning market practice. So if dates are sold by weight, like now when you buy dates, do they sell them by liter? No, you buy dates typically by what? By kilo, right? When you buy salt, do you buy liters of salt or kilos of salt? Kilos, right? But you buy, typically liters are used for liquids now, for example. So that even in the things that the Prophet ﷺ mentioned as being by weight or volume, that was based on the urf at that time, right? And there's some discussion. It's a very sensitive discussion, but it cannot be generalized. That the nas is ma'lul bil urf. That's very, very dangerous discussion that one has to really take it back to trustworthy jurists, that the prophetic prohibition there was conditional upon the custom of his time. That is very, very taken with utmost caution, because the basis is that the words of the Prophet ﷺ apply till the end of times, right? So the fatwa is that in this issue is i'tibar of how are things customarily sold, right? So someone tries to, let's say the majdul dates are really big. So could you say, okay, I'll sell you 25,000 majdul dates for 25,000? No, it won't work. Let's say there's some really cheapo date, like really low quality date, but they're really big bad dates, BBD. And you have some really good, these sukkari dates. They're small. So you say, I'll sell you 25,000 units of these dates for 25,000 units of your big dates. Could you sell it like that? By unit? Are dates typically bought by units? No. So we'd say no, that's riba. Why? Because that's just a way of circumventing, because practically what you're doing, the small dates weigh less. The big dates weigh more. So you're effectively, by selling the same units of dates, what are you doing? You're selling, let's say, 500 kilos of small, high-value dates for 1,000 kilos of big, low-value dates. And that's riba. So you have to consider in what way are things customarily sold. Right? So this is, so this is the basis in terms of riba in items of exchange. And the way to avoid it is just break it into two transactions, right? Break it into two transactions. There are a lot of contemporary applications. This is not the place to deal with them. This is the underlying principle that if you're set exchanging things, then there are three cases. Right? The criteria for riba is two matters: the category of the item of sale and the basis. If you're selling the same category, and of course then it would be on the same basis, then you have to sell at par and you cannot defer the sale. So you cannot sell 100 kilos of dates now for 100 kilos of dates due in the future. In the process, I'm prohibited it. If one of the meanings is found, you're selling the same selling something sold by weight for something sold by weight, let's say dates for apples, then you can sell different amounts because they're different categories, but they have to be sold. You cannot make a deferred sale on that basis. You want to do it, break it into two contracts. If they're two separate categories and they're sold in a different way, you're gonna buy 100 pens for apples. Apples are not sold in large quantities for units. You may sell 1 or 2 apples by unit, but in any large number, then you can you can do it with both at a variant amount and with deferral. Right? So hope that's clear. Then he goes into, sometimes the next part has a it's called a sarf, which is a contract of exchange. A contract of exchange. Right? Sarf is, and he says وعقد الصرف هو يعني عقد الصرف ما وقع على جنس الأثمان يعتبر فيه قبض عوضيه في المجلس. Okay. So a contract of exchange of the athman. A thaman is of that which is considered money, right? And a contract of money exchange, monetary exchange, the contract of monetary exchange is that which occurs between two things that are both considered money. In that, what counts is that both items of exchange have to be taken possession of in the same majlis, in the same session. So if I exchange, so what this classically relates to is gold and silver, right? So if I exchange 20 gold coins for 500 silver coins, then, of course, if I'm exchanging gold for gold, then it has to be the same jins. Then it has to be at par. Doesn't matter if this is really high quality gold and that's low quality gold, it has to be at par. Because we're exchanging gold for gold. It has to be at par, but it has to take the exchange itself, right? يعتبر فيه that we have قبض عوضيه. We have to take possession of both items of exchange. Right? The taking of possession has to be in the majlis. In contracts of monetary exchange. This applies if it's the same, gold for gold or silver for silver, it has to be at par, but the actual taking of possession, actual or effective, has to be in the majlis of the aqd, while we're still, when the transaction takes place. if we're exchanging gold for silver, we can, of course, gold and silver are different categories. So I can sell, they can be at different extents. So I sell you 200 dirham, 200 dinar for 5,000 dirham, for example, gold for silver, different extents. But the exchange needs to take place, the actual transfer of ownership has to take place in the same majlis. Now the big question arises, how do we apply that to exchange of money? So this has to do with how do we define modern currencies, right? So it's called, in Arabic, it's called al-awraq al-naqdiyya. Okay? These are what are called fiat currencies, right? Because now I'm not going to comment is gold-backed currency superior or not. I'm not even going to comment on that. But practically, historically, the bulk of economic activity took place on the basis of gold and silver as being the means of transaction. And legally, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has deemed these to be what is called athman khilqatan. Gold and silver are considered to be to be of intrinsic monetary value by the lawgiver, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, deeming them to be intrinsically athman. So they're considered athman khilqatan. Right? Athman khilqatan. Right? They're considered to be of intrinsic monetary value. Then, of course, when people started drifting away, so they had, historically, there were two types of currencies that are prevalent. There were what's called athman khilqatan, things that were intrinsically of monetary value, gold and silver. They're sold for their weight value. But then gold and silver are very valuable. So there used to be a third so this is, the first category had two items in it. That which is of intrinsic monetary value, right? Or that was considered currency, intrinsically, currency and of intrinsic monetary value are gold and silver. But then, how are you going to buy an apple with silver? It's so little. We're going to cut the silver coin. So they had a second level of currency, which is called athman istilahan. Right? This is athman istilahan. Right? Right? And which is what's called something considered conventionally to have material value. And historically, these are called fulus. Right? These are called, so there would be base, base currencies, right? Gold, silver, copper, brass, typically other metals, and they're called fulus because the muflis is a bankrupt person. You could have a pocket full of fulus, but you're still bankrupt. You don't have anything of worth because they're just used for small amounts, for small transactions. Anyways. Right? So you have the athman and then you have fulus. Historically, they used to say, la riba fil fulus. There's no riba when it comes to base currency. But that's only because they're used for small things. When they became more prevalent, they took another narration of the madhab that riba applies to fulus, to conventional currencies. Now, how do we treat money? Are they like gold? Are they like gold and silver? They're intrinsically, or they're like fulus. Now that's a broader discussion. There's an excellent article by Mufti Taqi Usmani. It's one of the very important articles on this. And there's a lot of historical debate about paper money. When it appeared in the Muslim world, a lot of debate. Some people went to extremes. They said they're like fulus. So some said this is haram to deal with. Right? And part of that was a reaction to colonialists. Right? And you have to look at many fatwa in the context. There's these colonialists coming, doing really weird things and taking advantage of the Muslims. So any self-respecting person would stand up to them. Right? Right? So paper currency, there's some of the fatwa, they have a context. Right? And you shouldn't mock those fatwa, but they're self-respecting. They say, you cannot dress in trousers, you cannot do this, you cannot do that. Why? Because they're colonizing your land, oppressing your people, draining your wealth, destroying everything you stand for, and now be like them. But there's a historical context to that did not apply to us. Anyways, so there's a lot of discussion. If one deems, modern currencies to be what's called fiat, to be considered like gold and silver, then the rulings of sarf apply to them. Right? And that's largely what the Arab scholars, contemporary Arab scholars say, for a number of reasons. Right? That modern currencies are considered to be like gold and silver. So therefore, they're athman. They are tier 1, even though they're conventional currency, not intrinsic currency, but they're considered like gold and silver exactly. So the rulings of sarf would apply to them. So if you exchange money online, etc., we have to ensure, because taking possession is either actual or effective. Effective taking, al-qabd al-hukmi, right? Effective taking of possession, it's called al-qabd al-hukmi, is when the rights, risks, and responsibilities of ownership accrue to the party that has taken possession. Right? And when that is convention, and that returns to convention. Right? So if I've effectively taken possession of it, I own it now. If it perishes, it's considered to perish in my property. Right? And what is, so that's the way they take that out. That if we legally consider that now the risk and responsibility of the item that you've taken effective possession of returns to you, then it's considered to be effective ownership. Right? And that happens with digital transactions and so on. That clear at the point of transaction? The Indian Hanafis take a slightly nuanced distinction from that. You can find that in Mufti Taqi Usmani's treatise. But interestingly, I actually got myself in slight trouble, but I managed to wiggle out of it. There's a very respected Iraqi faqih who was asked about monetary exchange, etc., like 15 years ago. And I wanted to point something out, because Mufti Taqi said something different in his treatise. But this is one very respected. I just kept quiet, but I sort of put my head down. I said, do you have anything to say? I was just quiet. But he's an older, experienced guy, Shaykh Ahmed Dibbo. I said, I said, no, I think you have something to say. I said, well, Mufti Taqi Usmani has a treatise on this where he presents a slightly different house. He said, Ittaqillah. And he said, so what did he say? He said, he was sitting next to me when we signed the resolution of the Islamic Fiqh Academy on the position that Shaykh Ahmed Dibbo had just explained. That basically goes down to that paper money, given that paper money is just like gold and silver in our times, then the rulings of sarf would apply fully to them. So Mufti Taqi signed off on that. Ittaqillah. How can you say something like that? Alhamdulillah, I had the book with me in the car that we had come with. I forget whose car it was. We're having lunch with Shaykh Ahmed Dibu. We took him outside the meeting of the Islamic Fiqh Academy that's taking place in Jordan. So I said, Sidi, it's in such and such work of Mufti Taqi. I have a copy of it in the car. So showed it to him. He sort of actually checked the paper, like almost as to see are the papers in the book itself. He sort of checked, So, but he was very fair with it, even though, So the rulings of sarf practically also apply to monetary exchange. Now, with formal monetary exchange, this happens instantaneously now, right? With digital transactions and stuff. But when doing an informal exchange, right? So you say, okay, I'll send you $100, but let's say someone's traveling to Pakistan. So you want rupees. So you say, okay, I'll send you a bank transfer of $5,000, and you can send me, and I'll pick up the equivalent rupees when I get to Karachi. Can you do that? According to the stricter opinion, you cannot. Why? Because there has to be qabdul iwadain fil majlis. So if both transactions are initiated in a form, so most types of online monetary exchange, there's instant transfer, right? But the challenge with bank transfers, that becomes an issue. Or in a situation, it's okay, I'll send you this money, and I'll pick up the money over there. Now, this could be sarf. There's a transaction that they used to do in the old days called saftaja or suftuja, right? Where traders, what they do? They'd give money to someone here, right? Because let's say you're traveling by caravan. If you think about the old days, you're traveling by land from Toronto, or whatever Toronto was called a few hundred years ago, all the way down to Florida, but riding on your mule. Mules are more resilient than donkeys, right? And you're carrying all this money because you're going to go and buy a house there. And you don't have an army with you, whatever, right? That's pretty dangerous. So this thing emerged. You'd give your money here, and you'd pick up the money over there. And that's, and that was a problematic transaction. But here, practically, if you do something like this, right, you transfer money to somebody and say, I'll pick up, let's say the exchange rate is 1 to 100. I send you $5,000 here, I'll pick up 50,000 rupees, whatever the exchange rate, let's say it's 1 to 100, right? When I get to Karachi, Lahore, Islamabad, wherever you go. You can't do that. But you want to transfer the money now, you could break it into two transactions. That's what. How do you break it into two transactions? Do a promissory transaction and then finalize it on the spot. But there has to be some assuming trust, right? There's one potential way. It's not a binding way, right? So you can't, because if you just make it a contract, I'll give you $100 now for 10,000 rupees that I'll pick up when I get to here. The contract took place now, and the taking possession did not happen in the same session. What you can do is you can transfer the money, it's in safekeeping with the party. Right? So you've given let's say your $500 in safekeeping over there. That's phase 1 of the transaction. Step 2 of the transaction is when you get there, you will effect the monetary exchange. Why would you do that and not just do it when you get there? One, you don't want to carry the money there. Number 1. Right? Number 2, you'll get a better exchange rate. You want to get it on today's for whatever economic reasons or practical reasons you want to do that. You can break it into two transactions. What happens all the time? AeroPress, my favorite way of making coffee, even though I've been training on pour over for several years now. I primarily drink pour over just to master how to make pour over, even though I much prefer the AeroPress. But now AeroPress has released AeroPress Go, for travelers. And you can travel with an AeroPress, but there's a lot of moving parts. But this all consolidates. There's a mug and all the things. They all fit together, very compact. So at our, the family gathering at the in-laws, I told my twin brother-in-laws about them, right? Because 2 of 3 of Mama's brothers love coffee, the twins. So I was telling them about it. So we have a coffee exchange familial relationship. When they travel, they usually get me coffee. They run out. I'll take coffee. They'll bring coffee. Like we have a coffee mafia, but we sort of now talk less about it because the wives get a little annoyed by our coffee talk at family gathering. So I decided to pre-order 3 units of the AeroPress Go. 1 for myself, 1 for the twins. There's a pre-order, and then a sale takes place when they're actually produced, which is early December. So it's broken into 2 parts. This is very normal in transactions. So if there's a situation where you are going to make a money exchange, and a very common way is when people go on vacation, for example, etc., you break it into 2 parts. In many formal transactions, this happens. Sometimes riba happens in Hajj. People, it's not common, but just to be aware, some people go on Hajj. What do they do? Because they don't want to travel with their own money. They'll give either informally to the Hajj group leader. They'll give them the money. I'll give you, whatever, $1,000, and I'll pick up X rial from you when we get to the destination. If you make it in one transaction, that is riba. You've gone on Hajj and done riba. And there's no meaning. You can't, if your agreement was, I'll give you $1,000 now and I'll pick up whatever amount. Sometimes they don't even agree on how much it is there. Like people get into argument because currency exchanges fluctuate. 3 months later, the exchange rate has changed 15%. One party wants more, the other party wants less. Can't do that. I say, well, what we meant is, I'm giving it to you in safe. No. Contracts are based on what the agreement is. So if you don't break it into 2 parts, I'm giving you $1,000 in safekeeping. When we get there, can we exchange it at? And you need to agree. Are you doing it and doing it at the rate at the time of exchange, which is the basis, right? Because that's when the transaction is taking place. You have to break it into 2 parts. So this is something that has practical implications, right? That if you are doing monetary exchange, and any time in general you're making international transactions, you have to be clear what is the currency the payment is due on, even on a loan. It happens. You bought something now, payable a year later. So I said, but I'm Canadian, because now the exchange rate has changed. I say what, like 75 cents to the dollar or something, whatever the exchange rate is. It makes a big difference when it was like 68. Okay? So it's important to be clear on that. Okay. Then he says, وَمَا سِوَاهُ مِمَّا فِيهِ الرِّبَا يُعْتَبَرُ فِيهِ التَّعْيِينُ وَلَا يُعْتَبَرُ فِيهِ التَّقَابُض. In anything else, right? Meaning outside of that which is considered athman, to be currencies, in that which relates to riba, specification is sufficient. Actual taking of ownership is not a consideration. So for example, if we sell dates, in our time sold by weight, for rice, we just have to specify, you don't have to actually take possession of it in the majlis, right? We cannot defer it, but it's okay, I sell you these dates, we specified, these 100 kilos of dates for this 65 kilos of basmati rice, we need to specify it. So, we set them aside, etc. Said, this is yours, this is mine. Okay, we don't have to actually take ownership of it there, because we say, okay, at the end of the week we will deliver everything, but it needs to be specified. And part of specification is al-ifraz, that they're separated from other. Right? Now, some things you cannot ensure parity. So he says, وَلَا يَجُوزُ بَيْعُ الْحِنْطَ بِالدَّقِيقِ وَلَا بِالسَّوِيقِ. It's not permitted to sell wheat itself for flour, nor can you sell wheat for oiled flour. So sawiq is, is cooked flour. So one of the ways to preserve flour, they put a little oil in it and preserve it that way, so it wouldn't go bad. Right? God knows what they did with it afterwards. I don't understand things, right? Because it's not possible there, right? Because the wheat itself, there's the grain plus these other things, and the flour. So how can you ensure parity? So because parity is not possible to ensure. He says, now why would you do this? God knows, but says, وَيَجُوزُ بَيْعُ اللَّحْمِ بِالْحَيَوَانِ. It is permitted to sell meat for an animal. عند أبي حنيفة وأبي يوسف. Right? But, and the reason, right? Because because in the old days, animals were sold by unit, and the meat is sold by weight, right? So لأن الحيوان لا يوزن عادة, right? Because when you sell a sheep, its weight is a wasf, it's a quality. So you're selling something sold by units for something sold by weight. So you could sell them. And again, it's much simpler just to break into two transactions, but if you do that, right? So selling something sold by weight, namely laham, meat, for something sold by units, right? Because the weight of the animal is a wasf, it's a quality in the animal. Right? I'm buying this cow. Like, a 100 kilo cow is not $100, and a 150 kilo cow is not $150, right? It's one of multiple factors in the sale of the cow. So it's a quality. ويجوز بيع الرطب بالتمر مثلا بمثل. It is permitted to sell الرطب, right? Fresh dates for tamr, which is dry dates, at par only. Because here, because if there's the same category, then no variance is allowed. There are some that said, well, unless it would lead to dispute, because the problem is some rutab, like some fresh dates, are sold with the stock, etc. So you cannot ensure parity of the dates itself, and that's discussed in the contrary. وَالْعِنَبِ بِالزَّبِيبِ. It's permitted to sell grapes for raisins. Right? Likewise, at par. Now, if the raisins are worth more, break it into two transactions. That's safer. وَلَا يَجُوزُ بَيْعُ الزَّيْتُونِ بِالزَّيْتِ. It's not permitted to sell olives for olive oil. وَالسِّمْسِمِ بِالشَّيْرَجِ. Nor sesame for shayraj, which is sesame oil. حتى يكون, and unless you're doing something very strange, which is حتى يكون الزيت والشيرج أكثر مما في الزيتون والسمسم. Unless the amount of oil, of olive oil or sesame oil, is more than what is in the the olive or sesame of oil. So the increase would be ascribed to all the other things that are in the olive and the sesame, which would be a very strange economic transaction. You want to do that? Just break it into two transactions. The idea being olive oil, you have 2 liters of olive oil. You want to exchange it for dates, for olives. Olives contain olive oil. So you have to make sure you would sell them for parity. But what's the problem? If you sell them at pair, okay, we estimate that the olives contain, this amount of olives contains the equivalent of 2 liters of olive oil. But then you're selling 2 liters of olive oil for 2 liters of olive oil plus the flesh and the other elements of the olive. So you'd have to sell enough olive oil that you have the same amount of olive oil in the plus extra olive oil, even a little bit, that encompasses the other things that are there. Do yourself a favor, break it into transactions, right? يعني فيكون الدهن بمثله والزيادة بالثجير, so that the oil is for the like amount of oil in the olive or in the sesame, and the extra olive oil is for the residual. The thajir, right, is the residue, that which remains after pressing the oil from the olive or the sesame. ويجوز بيع اللحمان المختلفة بعضها ببعض متفاضلا. You can sell different types of meat in exchange for each other at variance, because they're considered different categories. So, beef for chicken, beef is considered one meat, and chicken meat is considered another. So you can sell them at different weights, right? وكذلك ألبان البقر والغنم, and likewise the milk of cows and cattle, because they're 2 different categories. وخل الدقل بخل العنب, and likewise the vinegar from dates for the vinegar of grapes, because they're 2 different categories. And that returns to market practice. Right? ويجوز بيع الخبز بالحنطة والدقيق متفاضلا. It's permitted to sell bread for wheat. Bread for wheat or bread for flour in different quantities, because they're considered, because the fuqaha look at usage. The usage of bread is different from the usage of wheat. Then they're sold differently. So you could sell them at variance. One is sold by, but it's better to avoid it again. Always the underlying principle, break it into 2 transactions. Last issue before we get to Babu Salam, last 2 issues, says ولا ربا بين المولى وعبده. There's no riba between a master and his slave, because العبد وما يملكه لمولاه, the slave and all that they possessed belong to their master. And of course, there's a spiritual meaning to that as well, but so riba does not arise. Of course, but injustice remains injustice, right? So if someone gives spending money to their servant and says, give me back this much more, that's unjust, but it wouldn't be considered riba. And then there's an issue, and we'll close with this. He says, but understanding the previous issue, there is no riba between a master and his slave. Why? Because this expression, la riba, the la is, what kind of لا نافية. لا ربا. Riba is what? Grammatically? لا نافية للجنس. It's the la of categorical negation. What is riba here? The ism of la, النافية. Right? La takes what? Two ma'mul. Right? La riba, something. Right? So, what is being prohibited? What is to understand this statement? Right? What is being negated from? There's no riba. No riba. Something between the master and his servant. What is the taqdeer? It's not the prohibition. Rather, it is لا riba موجودة. No riba exists. Why? Because there's no contract of exchange that takes place. Right? So here the taqdeer is no riba exists. And that's the aqal. That's affirming the less. And in the Hanafi school, التقدير من باب الضرورة. When we have to say something is implicit, this is considered necessity. والأصل التقدير الأقل or الأدنى. If something is implicit, say what's the least that can be affirmed? To say that no riba is prohibited, you have to have sufficient evidence to go against the decisive texts of the Quran and the Sunnah about the prohibition of riba. But rather here, no riba exists because there's no exchange between the master and the servant. What the servant between the master and the slave? Because the slave belongs to the master, and whatever the slave owns, if they're a full slave, if the mukatab, etc., that's a separate issue, belongs to the master. And the reason this is important, because the next statement is grossly abused, which is وَلَا بَيْنَ الْمُسْلِمِ وَالْحَرْبِيِّ فِي دَارِ الْحَرْبِ. There is no riba between a Muslim and a harbi in Dar al-Harb. Right? Classically, the Hanafis divided the world into two halves. There's the lands of Islam and Dar al-Harb, and the abode of war. There's a two-part classification. And this classification is what's called shara' mu'awwal. It is describing a practical reality and then deducing the legal consequences based on the primary texts. Now there's one way of looking at it, that this two-way. Now what is the characteristic of Dar al-Islam? In Islam, you have, forget everything else, the religious, spiritual significance, the legal significance of Dar al-Islam is that you are, as a Muslim, you have legal rights in Dar al-Islam. You have legal rights in Dar al-Islam. Dar al-Harb, just stripped away of everything else, in Dar al-Harb, the assumption is you don't have legal rights. You don't have legal rights. You are not, you transact on the basis of being a legal person. Right? So you are not, you don't have rights in Dar al-Harb. In this classical conception, you're not a legal person. Now, if you're not a legal person, a contract is a aqd that takes place between two legal transacting parties. So, if you zoom back to the year 125 after the Hijrah, 141 after the Hijrah, right? So Imam Abu Hanifa is in his final decade of his life. You go into Europe. You go there You go to the marketplace. You are a nobody. If you enter into a transaction, you have no legal standing whatsoever. So that's not considered a transaction, because you are not considered a legal person there. So what is taking place is not a aqd. That's why they say لأنه لا عقد بين مسلم وحربي في دار الحرب, because there's no contract between a Muslim and a non-Muslim in Dar al-Harb. And that's why I say وَإِنَّمَا تُمْلَكُ أَمْوَالُهُمْ بِالْإِبَاحَةِ الْأَصْلِيَّةِ. Rather, their property is only taken possession of it by permission. They allowed it. So it's considered not to be a transaction. You know? So let's say I bought your flask in a non-Muslim land. Right? Well, let's say the flask belongs to Lady Jane of Paris. I gave her 100 dirham, she gave me the flask. It's not a contract, it's just she agreed to take my money, I agreed to take her flask. So there's no contract, because if we went into dispute, I have no legal standing. Now, whether we say, there's one thing that no, one way of dividing the world that no, there is a third category of Darul Aman. There's an abode of safety, which is any land where you have a non-Muslim land, but you have legal recognition there. It's not a state of where your legal persona is being denied. But even if you don't accept that and say no, it's Dar al-Islam, and Muslim lands and non-Muslim lands are considered Dar al-Harb. To say that the same rulings apply is counterfactual. Do you have a cell phone contract? Is that a contract? Yeah. Right? To say that there's no contract between you and the cell phone company is delusion. Have you rented a home? To say that it's not really a contract, all it is they agreed to let me live there and I've agreed to just let them take some money. It's a contract. Everything that you do is a contract. Right? Denying that is fiction. It's not fiqh, it's fiction. Right? So the statement here, la riba, it's la riba mawjudatun. Right? No riba exists between a Muslim and a harbi in Dar al-Harb. This is on the supposition, right? Because he says لأن مالهم مباح في ديارهم, right? Because their wealth is permitted in their lands, meaning تملك بالإباحة لا بالعقد, because it's taken possession of it through permission. So in whichever way one takes their property, as long as it's not done by cheating, it's permitted. Right? So this is and there's some discussion on this in terms of the issue itself. In Hashiyat ibn Abdin, volume 4, page 188. So some of the ulama looked at the underlying cause and said, no, these rulings apply to a state where you have no legal recognition. Where you do, this does not apply, full stop. A full stop. It's counterfactual. Other ulama, amongst them, for example, Maulana Ashraf Ali Tanvi in Imdad al-Fatawa, he says, in our times, the fatwa is necessarily on the position of Abu Yusuf, which is that there is riba between Muslims and non-Muslims in Dar al-Harb, even if you don't have legal recognition. Right? But either way, saying that this is Dar al-Harb, if it were Dar al-Harb by the classical definition of the ulama, then you're not allowed to be here. Right? That you're in a state of major sin. Right? Number two, there's no contracts. And then, but it entails a lot of things, because classically, then, a Muslim could engage in, you could run a brothel because there's no contract. There's some ladies who decide to to do whatever they're doing, and there's people giving you money. You could sell pornography. You could sell pork. You could sell alcohol, because there's no sale. It just looks like a sale. And that is completely counterfactual, right? And all the harms that arise from the institution of riba affects that minority, right? والله سبحانه وتعالى أعلم وهو أحكم وهو ربنا ونعم الوكيل وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم.